like from the very beginning, we would love to have a dialogue, starting with our like close circle of friends and people who are interested in architectural pedagogy and cultural studies. So this roundtable discussion, the sixth, we have two young and bright architects based in New York City. And AbuBakr is an architect, researcher, and writer who did his master's in advanced architectural design from the University of Columbia. He is interested in critical discourse in architecture. He was also awarded the Arguments Honor Awards and the William Kinney Traveling Fellowship. And Bhargav is an architectural professional with a comprehensive experience in a variety of projects. And he is involved in multiple initiatives and organizations, along with his intellectual interest in architecture, new technologies, and culture. He also accomplished his master's in University of Buffalo in material culture and inclusive design. And we are we are like thrilled to have this conversation with you guys, and we can start with questions about your individual practices, then we can move to discussion about architects' role in politics of aesthetics, power dynamics in the construction world, etc. So I can start a question to AbuBakr. Okay. First of all, I have to say that I am very impressed with the literary quality of your text. I was like reading, like really curious to see about next line. And can you tell us more about the piece you wrote about Sudan Sport City, where you discuss how the building archived the details that tie together the narratives of the collective past, present, and the future. And you mention its relation with the Sudanese identity.
First of all, thank you guys for having me here. I'm really glad to be here. Emma is a very close friend, and I'm really happy to join on the roundtable and talk with you both. I've watched a couple of your roundtables, and the topics of discussion are always really interesting. Yeah, I mean, just to jump right in, the Sports City piece was a piece written for a design group or a curatorial group called Locale, and the main idea of the piece was to discuss archiving of any sort in Sudan. And for me, growing up, and this is something probably Amal knows as well, the Sudan Sports City is basically one of these projects that we all know, and like we've all come to grow up around. It never seemed to like come to an end or a conclusion. It just existed for a long time. And whoever I talk to seems to have some sort of memory or idea of the existence of this project, but not a grasp of the entire story. And so I sort of kicked off this investigation of it and tried to understand, first off, how it came to be to start with, but then also what we have now and what use we can make of it. And the main idea was what the thing about the sports city, it starts exactly at a certain period where Sudan, it has a history in Sudan's political climate as basically this very popular project that was used almost by all regimes that came to rule Sudan as a rallying cry, as a promise of infrastructure, as something to sort of buy the people with and convince them that this new government was finally going to do something big and something lasting with a lasting effect. But it almost never happened. And then in 1989 was this pivotal year. There was a coup, new sort of military regime has taken over. and they sort of did the same thing. They jumped back in and said, "We'll build." For me, from the start of construction, the failure that happened, basically construction stopped very soon after, and piece by piece, parts of the project plot kept getting sold off in very mysterious circumstances, sort of portioned off to this entity or this non-governmental agency or whatever. And it kind of reflected very clearly what was happening in Sudan, vis-a-vis the politics that were taking place, the corruption, the sort of the bad dealing that was taking place between private citizens sometimes and the government themselves. And it just encapsulated this idea of this kind of infrastructure aimed for a certain population with a lot of promises that were sort of built up on it. And then sort of slowly being portioned off or torn off and like disintegrating in front of people's eyes. And then it stayed stagnant for a long time. And that's one of the other things. There was a structure there. It was just these concrete sort of structural elements that, they create these like ribbed structures that carry the seating itself, that create the boundary for the sports city. And they were in such disrepair and no one seemed to care. But everyone just lived alongside it. Like everyone just assumed that that's how it's supposed to be. And the parallels were just incredibly easy to draw between what was happening in the country and what was being reflected daily on that structure itself and the decay it was undergoing. And then finally, there's a lot of these projects of infrastructure that are sort of neglected. They're not like something that's very specific to Sudan, but they're specific to a lot of countries where money runs out and governments sort of like leave these projects hanging. And for me, I wanted to see, well, now we have this project that's effectively a ruin now. It's not even a new sports city now. It's unbuilt, but it's already in ruins. And so what do you do with it? Like, what do you still sort of try to finish it off? You can't use it. There's a lot of structural issues. And so for me, that's how I sort of thought about ending then, or sort of that's the conclusion I came with, is that even if we're not capable of utilizing it as a people or sort of uniting behind it as sort of a piece of infrastructure finally that's available for us, it just becomes something as a reminder or this living real life physical archive that you can almost point to and trace this sort of line through the history of Sudan and kind of pinpoint exactly what happened. And sort of writing the article itself kind of was for me that act, sort of archiving all those stages, understanding what changed, who were the parties involved, and then finally arriving with to the conclusion that maybe there's nothing to be done that's useful with the physical structure, but maybe it can be seen as an archive in that sense.
Very interesting.
No, it's very interesting when we have these kind of buildings that kind of go into parallel with the political situation, because a lot of the time when it comes to architecture, people kind of, think that it has no relationship to, the social or political situation that is happening. But this one is very interesting because you can see the parallels throughout it's being built. And so it's a very interesting project to research. And so the next question would be for Bhargav. And you know that we're very interested in studying museums and museologies, and you're currently working on an extension construction of the Hudson River Museum, which is an important cultural construction in the New York metropolitan area. And the museum declares its mission is to engage, inspire, and connect diverse communities through the power of art, science, and history. Can you talk a bit about that and how it feels to be involved in a museum that has a great collection?
Yeah, so the Hudson River Museum, throughout the history, New York is a very prominent location in terms of history, because starting from 1600 or 1700s, the it has gone, the whole city has gone through different settlements and different kind of cultural, even representations, like maybe like 1700s. It was from the Dutch colonies. Then came the English settlers, and so and so. And the whole location of the museum became very much prominent because where the city was not able to build, and even to obtain a land within the city, it was very hard for them. So what they try to do is go to the suburbs or somewhere like much more farther from the city, because previously, like in the early 1800s and all, the settlers were much more building only residential communities, and even for a public infrastructure building, they came to, they were like, there's a need for the they felt the need for a public infrastructure only after a series of communal riots. Like maybe like Dutch settlers were fighting against English settlers, and English settlers were fighting against maybe natives, and so and so. And there was no single place where different people were able to come and integrate. So that's how the whole so in any infrastructure, especially in cultural, any cultural infrastructure or civic building within New York City, it was so hard to develop. So what the one of the early options that they came up was, let's move these civic infrastructure buildings out of the city area itself, where it might not bring in more riots or any other uh, activities, like maybe like mob lynching and stuff like that. So these guys, what they did was they it is more like a private museum started by a wealthy family within the outskirts of the city, and then the city of they tried to bring in integrate it with the different communities. And then they were, even now, there is a huge difference, or there's a large discrepancies between the type of inhabitants within the city. Like the area of the city is predominantly white, and but the users and all, it's been predominantly black and other communities for the civic infrastructure, because uh, throughout New York City, civic infrastructure has played a major role within the other communities, or the immigrants, or even the outsiders, because throughout the history, even if you're staying in a small residence, imagine like when for an immigrant, all they could afford was maybe like a single bedroom apartment, or a 2-bedroom apartment for a family of 5, 6, or 7. So to find an individual place where they could to have a sense of their own control, or to at least to focus on the things where they want to study, even for studying or something like that, museums and civic infrastructure played a key role. So that's how the relationship between the users and the infrastructure is being established. But if you look at the neighborhood, like uh, even like since it's a white
It cut off a little.
like that. So what they tried to do was
Bhargav, could you repeat last sentence, because there was the internet connection gap?
oh, okay. So there has always been some inhibitions by the people, like would I be welcomed within that infrastructure? Because predominantly, if you are a person of color, they would think, okay, you might be one of those guys who would be damaging the property, or who would have that in preconceived thoughts, right? So they weren't allowed much into the museums and stuff like that.
Really?
So yeah, even for the
What?
public libraries, people, I mean, New York has a long history of where they won't allow people into the museums uh, unless you are able to pay, and sometimes that's why most of the museums within New York, they made to I mean, one of the prominent policy was to make Mondays free for the museum. So whatever, pay as you wish, maybe like $1, a cent, whatever you want to pay. So that way it slowly generated, what do you say, a movement where people could actually go and interact with the art pieces. And even it's sometimes hard for people, right? Like this could be a huge discussion that's currently going within the cultural studies and museums, like these art pieces are my ancestor pieces and stuff, and it's hard for people like maybe like first generation immigrants, where oh, why are they showing that these pieces like belong to my country, as something like, oh, people used to be like that, or people live like that, rather than our lives. I mean, they are just depicting a scene of our life, but that's not the complete truth too. And they would try to depict certain scenes which would try to create emotion among the audience. So most of them might be drastic. What they prefer to do is uh, to evoke people. They try to engage hard hitting art. So maybe like that's why and to avoid all these problems, especially for the Hudson Museum that I was talking, we were like trying to create much more like this is like a part of extension to the existing museum. So we were trying to uh, develop a particular utility space where it won't be not it won't be that segregating, as well as trying to bring in like generic people and all. So one of the main spaces that the museum initially the whole program for the museum was, they were looking to create regular gallery areas and stuff, but they never had a space for what do you say, a theater or somewhere where they could actually bring in people from different areas. I mean, even to have shows and all, because for I mean, theaters and auditoriums are one of those areas where you focus on the content or the performance more than just a single piece of art, and you don't care about the person right and behind you, because you are just truly engaging with the art or performance. So in that way, that's the key reason why we try to integrate the auditorium at the ground level. So even after the performance, people could actually come outside and try to meet, talk, or whatever, have a discussion or something like that. Because uh, even once you see a performance, you would say, oh, it regards to the color, or just to kind of person you are. You're just trying to say, oh, that was a great performance, and artist was good, uh, and each person would have their own, what do you say, version of understanding the performance. So I might say, oh, it related something in this cultural context, or blah blah blah, and you would say, it also reflected maybe my kind of culture and some part in a different way. So, and then it would try to bring in, then it would generally try to educate both the audience and maybe like kind to bring in interaction between different people. So that was the whole thing why we designed the bottom portion as the auditorium and mostly like a public use. And then the above that we tried to create. The museum was needing much more like a storage area. That was part of the brief, and so and we were trying to utilize the maximum views we can get out, and not
Bhargav,
just
sorry,
the
it cut again.
Yeah.
It's the last-
You were talking about material, I guess.
Yeah.
You were saying we try to use something than the internet cut off.
So try to use the views to the outside. So because once we create go higher, we especially in that area, people could actually interact with the outer surroundings. Because if you look at most of the museums, they are all focused inwards, just only to the art. So we were trying to create because within the time of the whole area, they had
There is a big connection
Internet.
problem.
Yeah.
Until we
River.
come.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but there's a bit of problem. But that's focusing on outside is such a like old problem in the exhibition design.
Yeah. So we try to create just a small gallery area because even within the whole like 300 years of existence, Hudson River has been the only thing that hasn't changed, right? Or I mean the flow of the river. So even the trees and all might change even with the future. So we wanted that to be an art piece as well, because with
so
the
poetic.
yeah, so we just try to create a very small like 15 by 15 kind of area just to so that people could actually interact or saying and the rest of the space what we did was we used that as a regular gallery extension and stuff like that.
And I think in the States, sorry, we're continuing.
No.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm seeing a lot of museums in their mission page because it's my hobby to think museums mission page. They declare that bringing diverse community is their mission.
Yeah.
Such so ironic, but since AbuBakr is also practicing in New York, maybe it's we can ask his opinion as well.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, the office I used to work with them. Don't work with them anymore. I did during my time there actually work on one project, which was an extension for a museum, which is the Frick Museum or the Frick Collection, more accurately, which is just like your project and also a private collection in Manhattan in the Upper East Side of the Frick family. And this was a project. They do have a lot of beautiful paintings. It's mostly European collections. Think Manet, and also a lot of Italian, Dutch paintings.
Masters.
Yeah, and that was the project that we. The other was for the Corning Museum of Glass, which is a very interesting exhibition. The museum commissioned a sort of an exhibition for displaying a collection of glass used in 18th century Britain, but also with the idea of comparing it to the glass used in sort of for trading with merchants to buy slaves. So this was an interesting twist to the curatorial aspect of the of the exhibition. I don't think they did a good job in sort of showing both parts. I think the main idea of the exhibit was mainly to showcase really beautiful glass pieces from the 18th century England. But what was interesting was a lot of the collections. So one thing to know about that period is that glass was really expensive in the 18th century. So basically, one table set of glass was basically one person's wages for an entire year. So it was very expensive in comparison to what people used it for. And so a lot of trade or merchants would use glass as a trading tool between them and people who bought slaves, basically, when slavery was still something that happened. So glass beads were very common as something to trade. But then there was also a sort of very bizarre cultural exchange where um, glass pieces depicting, for example, blacks in minstrel dressing were something that was popular in sets, for example, which is kind of very disturbing as well. But also, even down the line, abolitionists would fund their campaigns by selling glass beads with "abolish slavery" sort of written on them. So it was kind of interesting to see that kind of dialogue sort of between the slavery movement and the pro-slavery movement, all of it sort of recorded in the glass pieces being bought and sold between those two parties. I only bring up this example just as an idea of where a lot of the curatorial practice is moving in the U.S. and especially in New York. One of the great things about New York is the amazing number of museums that we have there. There are a lot of museums to visit, a lot of
Yeah, that's true.
and a lot of them are moving to sort of challenge or uncover a lot of the narratives that were usually kind of um, ignored by museums mostly, especially narratives of black architects or black people or enslaved people at that time. And I think this museum, which is honestly all the way out in the north of New York, it's in Corning. We have like 2 hours
Yeah,
to go from New York City, but even they are sort of making an attempt to broaden their narrative to a certain extent. And I think in general, that is something that's going to happen even more so with more exhibitions and sort of uh, projects coming in for museums.
interesting fact about that Corning Museum is I worked there as a glass maker for 2 or 3 months. So, so
It's
for one of
a very beautiful thing,
yeah,
actually. Yeah.
so for while doing my masters over there at Buffalo, so Corning is pretty much like a 3-4 hours drive from there, and my study was pretty much like how to use glass as a
Oh, wow.
structural
Okay.
member.
Yeah.
So because glass could actually hold point loads like the load coming from the top, but it
Mhm.
can't hold the lateral loads.
I see.
So I was trying. So I did the whole workshop over there trying to um, develop a glass brick itself, which could carry the whole load of the structure, and also with the light and heat, it could actually glass has the amazing property of refraction and reflection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I use the refraction of the glass to heat up the floor slabs.
Wow.
So using that, we don't need to add in additional, heat requirements for the building. So my whole thesis and was working at that museum to develop those blocks and stuff like that.
No,
So
but that,
so it was very interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it is. It does
Yeah.
sound very interesting. But also for like,
It
with
feels
the,
like New York is small.
It is small and big at the same time. It's a very
Yeah.
genre.
no, but with the evolution also of the conversation, it was very interesting from, Bhargav was explaining how at a certain point, there was not even access, for people of color to go into these kind of museums. And then with how Buck was explaining that now with curatorial practices, they're trying so much to integrate new narratives. So it does seem very interesting, the evolution that New York City had with these museums and curatorial practice, and it'd be very interesting to see where they would move forward in the future also with these types of museums. And so it's a very interesting conversation. We maybe can go back to it a little bit later, but would like to continue a little bit with our line of questioning, and then maybe we can continue this conversation later if you have time. And so this question would be for AbuBakr. And so from my experience, in Sudan, that the architectural field has, many elements from foreign architectural schools of thoughts and construction techniques, and etc. And you had, experience there, and then you moved to New York and started working in New York in a context where there was more, more local architectural school of thoughts and construction techniques. But in this case, you were more of someone coming from outside that context and experiencing it opposite to the one in Sudan. So can you tell us a little bit about the contrast in these two experiences, and also as continuation to one of the pieces that you are writing?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. I'd say during the practice was different. It's much more organized, and the flow of projects is usually much more linear and easier in projects in New York, I have to say. But in terms of contrasting styles, one thing about projects, specifically in New York, the U.S. not necessarily, but specifically in New York, is there are very tight stylistic controls on what you can sort of do. For example, if you're working in areas like Brooklyn or the sort of the west side or Greenwich Village, all of these are places that are protected by landmark committees, and what you can do is mostly interior work or interior renovation. So you can't really change what the city looks like. So your impact on the actual city is very much minimized. By contrast, if you go to places to Midtown or even all the way down to downtown, there's always a new skyscraper that's being built by someone with a lot of glass, steel, that kind of typical New York skyline image that you get when you're thinking about that. So you're able to see different approaches. There's a breadth of skills. There are people who are just entirely skilled in renovating old brownstones in Brooklyn. People whose entire workforce is skyscrapers and towers. But in comparison to Sudan, I'd say in Sudan there's a lot of financial restrictions and an absence of some sort of architectural lineage, if I could call it that way. In New York, at least, it's almost easy to spot who built which buildings. That kind of history of which buildings influenced what is obvious. In addition to the fact that with the code being so restrictive, you can almost always understand how the building came to be if you just sort of break down the code that applies to it. So if it's air rights, if it's how high the building could be, the code and the regulatory body sort of very much restricts what you see with how the building looks like. And that's been sort of very typical in all of the projects. I've worked in interior projects. I've worked in full-on sort of museum projects that are built from the ground up. That's always the overriding thing, is that what does the code require? And there are sort of very specific New York problems. There's always the New York problem of how does your building meet the street? New York streets are very busy, and being on a grid sort of crosswalk makes it important that their building is very accessible to the street. There's always this struggle between private property owners and walkers on the street, and that kind of accessibility almost always translates basically to better foot traffic for stores on the ground floor or easier access for people to the building itself. So that's always something that's, and these are things that are very different in Khartoum. I am actually in Khartoum now, and you can see that there's a very big struggle now between what's yours and what belongs to the street now, which is people are sort of extending all the way out into the street. There's a lack of material coherency. People build with a lot of materials that aren't exactly suitable climatically to Sudan, but even local in terms of the costs or their ease of procurement. So there's a lot of differences in how the like practices are responding to issues, and I kind of break that down to basically the regulations, the architectural lineage, and finally basically the money. Honestly, like how much money is available to build things in on those different contexts. Yeah.
One thing is not clear to me. Maybe I missed that part. Like, you said lack of architectural vocabulary in Sudan, or architectural lineage in the sense like there's. And you mentioned in New York you can more or less understand which building done by which architect. But you didn't explain why there's this contrast in Sudan.
Okay. I think one of what I meant by architectural lineage is maybe this is something that's in European architecture, in Western architecture, even Japanese architecture, you can understand or you can follow which architects have been influenced by the ones that came before them. You can almost draw a line to who worked in whose office and who's kind of copying whose style or trying to break away from it. And in Sudan, I don't see that happening in some way. I think that's mostly to do with the idea that most buildings are kind of not clearly identifiable, save for a few buildings. I think maybe some large projects like banks and stuff like that are the ones that you can sort of track who built what. But and most of the buildings are kind of commissioned by other architects, and it's not very clear most of the time who's built them. And that also has to do with our education. If Emma recalls correctly, a lot of our education in schools was Western based, which was something that was very odd. We never actually studied local Sudanese architects or local Sudanese architecture. It always almost went straight to Le Corbusier and modernism and that kind of stuff. And I think the lack of that architectural lineage, knowing or building upon what has been done before you, sort of removes a lot of the knowledge that's necessary for the practice to progress. Okay.
We just wanted to. Do you think also this has a relationship with the lack of caring about architectural heritage, for example? Because there's a lot of examples, for example, in Sudan where there was older buildings and their whole facades were destroyed, and covered by new materials. So do you think this lack of architectural lineage is also related to lack of caring about the heritage? Like you were saying in New York, like some buildings are protected like that. Do you think there's a relationship when it comes to, somewhere like Sudan?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we don't really document. We don't do a very good job of documenting these buildings to start with. We don't teach them in universities. The discourse about them isn't very mature. Like, no, they're just used as promotional materials mostly, and I don't know, at touristic campaigns. No one has actually done the legwork to sort of see where the origins of these buildings are, who's built them, what does it take to actually keep them in good shape. And so when it comes to fighting that fight of saying no, don't tear down these facades, don't replace them, there's not that strong of a case to be made for someone who sort of intent of doing it or has the funding or the money and wants to sort of change the building. And I think I actually place a lot of that not just on the building but on the architects themselves. I think they haven't dedicated enough time for that discourse to develop and sort of have strong arguments to fight that fight. Yeah.
Okay. No, I mean, I want to discuss more about that, but then I don't want it to become a lecture for me and Bhargav about North Sudanese heritage management. Maybe
No,
another roundtable.
no, I could actually relate to how Sudanese architecture and Indian architecture is pretty much like that in the same way, because most of the architects don't take much more responsibility of their own work. It's like once they get paid, okay, hands done, we are done with the project, and okay, that all belongs to the client, and we are not even responsible for that. And also the understanding, maybe the other interesting point is like in New York and these cities, half of the public space, like the street infrastructure, is owned by the building. Like in front, if the street walk in front of the building is actually owned by the property owner. So they have to make that if a guy falls in front of in on the sidewalk in front of his property, so if due to lack of maintenance and all, he could be, the property owner could be sued by the guy who fell down. So that pushes them to that pushes the owner to maintain the civic what do you say, sidewalks and stuff like that. So
Which
I mean,
ideally is supposed to be
yeah,
under maintenance by government, but
yeah, yeah. But the government pushes that responsibility right onto the owners, so that yeah.
actually, I wanted to ask a question to Bhargav, since already he mentioned about interesting experience with uh, glass brick, and you have such a wide range of interest in architecture. When I was checking your resume, I was surprised by your experience in the workshop of construction carpenter. And like in Italian like history of architecture subjects we study, there's a tendency that masters, contemporary masters, and even like Renaissance masters, comes from the background of stone carving or like carpenter. Even when we look at Adolf Loos, he like they study furniture and carpenter, like the maybe the need of articulating some elements by hand. And I want to ask, what was your personal motivation? Why you think that you need this experience?
I mean, for me, I mean, maybe I could say more for most of the people from the eastern part of the world, even from maybe like even from the Arabic construction predominantly is concrete and different materials of usage back in our countries, maybe mud bricks and so and so. But within the States, there is a different kind of construction that goes for different kinds of buildings. Especially for the residential, you would see a lot of wood being used for the construction. So for me to actually start as to work as a construction worker, the initial idea was to get acquainted with the materials and to know more about why they build, why they actually use these materials for the building itself. I mean, people could generally say using for use wood for the construction, the amount of wood that we use. Actually, we need to cut down trees, and it has a huge sustainability impact and amount of pollution that might be, or whatever amount of ecological impact that has on using those material. But the main reason why the people over here use, because throughout the centuries, that was the only predominantly available material within the United States. So it has been like since anyhow the people have been growing a lot larger number of trees, we could actually use them itself, and those are free, and that with that mindset they have started. And for me to know that what actually how people build the buildings, and to know like importance of the materials that goes into the projects, it was a very strong interest, because unless you know the local materials, or even what kind of people are actually affected by the building that you build, right? Like for us it would be a single line saying use I mean, for us or what do you say, client would say bring in the most expensive marble or something from Italy or some quarry in some area. But what you could, I mean, you once if you know your own local material and the knowledge of if you're actually looking for just the look or just to portray it's so and so, rather than doing that, what you could do is like I could recommend this material from the local area, which would be crafted by this carpenter and so and so. So in that way he actually it brings in more like communal feeling. Okay, it has been touched by this carpenter, this marble guy, and who uses this material. And so it brings a more like once you know the maker and the creator behind some piece, an art or whatever, even an object of a building, then you would say, oh, you would appreciate the building and the thought and everything which went behind it, rather than just following even if for a maintenance of that building you can't get, imagine like you bought thousands of tiles from Italy, and maybe like 10-20 tiles have broken throughout the years of maintenance, and just to get those 20 tiles you don't need to get all the way to Italy and get those 20 tiles. And maybe like even the whole process of those tiles might have been vanished. Maybe they are not using the same technology that they have used long time. So this creates a whole scenario of destroying the whole material itself, and then they need to what do you say, repair it and maintain it. So there's a whole different world within the usage of materials in the building. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to start or at least work at the bottom, knowing that why these guys use these materials, and knowing that part of the equation. So
Impressive.
Yeah, very. Okay, so now let's dig deep into.
We have half an hour, right?
Yeah. So let's dig deep into the other last questions. So we have like now questions generally about architecture. And so the first one we had was because we've been thinking about this a lot, and it's what is the architect's role in changing the design scene, particularly when we talk about, museum architecture? Do architects have that much power, or do the people who have power choose the architects that they can control? And so we would like to just discuss a few like you know big names like star architects. And so I'm just gonna share my screen for a few seconds here. Does everyone see my screen?
yeah,
And so we have an example here.
I am part.
Yeah, exactly. This museum in Qatar, which is Islamic museum in Qatar, which was designed according to him. He was trying to find, the essence of Islamic architecture, and he thought that maybe it would be in Andalusia, but then he thought that it had too much color, and Qatar represents, the desert. And so he started looking, and eventually he settled to the mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo. And so it has some of the elements of colors, the layering of the volumes, and a bit of the interior. That we have another example of Foster of the National Museum, also in Qatar, just to put a contrast, which he took from the design of the Desert Rose. And so that one was based on, historical architectural context, and this one was based mostly on the location and the flower there. And this is the interior, and this is the building that it was next to, which is one traditional building of, let me just, I just don't want to pronounce it mistakenly, the Palace of Sheikh Abdullah bin Jassim al-Thani, which was a restored building, and it has the view to the other one. And so we would just like to, ask this question of what is the role of architects when it comes to museum architecture? And so if either of you would like to, start.
I mean, I could go for.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Especially for the architect's role in museum. Predominantly most of these museums that you have showcased have a predominant role within the developing the whole urban neighborhood as well as the cultural. These buildings are at a larger scale, and also in terms of cultural representation as well as in a larger urban scale, this has a profound impact.
Mm-hmm.
So, to understand the role of an architect, we need to start with the scale of the project as well as the significance of the project.
Mm-hmm.
So, especially when we try to, as an architect or even the architects in the Western world, what they try to develop is try to create an iconic image or iconic uh, mm, infrastructure for the city. And this whole notion has started with Sydney Opera, because the whole economics behind these kind of large buildings have started with the Sydney Opera, where if you go through the history of the Sydney Opera House, that single building itself brought the huge number of tourists, which was more like it tripled the economy of the whole that part of the Australia. So starting from that aspect of the design, and how that's when most of the people came to know the importance of creating an iconic building or something. Now it has become more like, what do you say, even if you look in the linear timeline, at the 60s or 70s, or the time of that building, uh, that building being built, it was only the only monument. Maybe like if you look throughout the history, like uh, wonderful monument, maybe like from my own country, maybe like Taj Mahal, or even some other palace or some other in certain area. This was one of those buildings which was predominantly acclaimed throughout the architectural community and world, and it was also in a huge scale where they were trying to build a whole larger building, uh, which could actually revive the economy as well as bring in more cultural identity to the Australia. So that's how that building started influencing the other architects. Like even now, if you look at the museums done by a big or all the Norman Foster and these guys, they tend to look in that as a single idea, which could generate an dialogue directly with the investors for the museum. Like if you look at to convince a client, a single client is different from to convincing a government regulatory as well as the investors of the museum. So for them, they would say, okay,
The internet is
like if
sorry.
can,
Talked about convincing the investors.
yeah.
Sorry.
So for architects in the process of convincing them, convincing the investors and all, they forget the public and the much more like a role of individual of the local citizen among that region of the country. Like I mean, for the people within that region, they might not
We are unlucky today.
I cut again.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can I mean, should I log in from other? Should I get out and log back in?
No, I think it's internet. It's not Skype.
Okay.
You might if you do. Like,
Yeah, it's fine. Finish your continue your point.
Yeah. So
It gets frustrating. I know.
yeah. So
You're
I mean, in the process, the architects sometimes tend to neglect the whole uh, the users of the building rather than just focus meeting the needs of the top tier of the management.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that's how most of the architects approach, I believe so.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, I agree with you. But I think it also depends on where the museum is built. A lot of the museums, or the ones at least that Amal showed, were in sort of countries where these are almost commissioned by, let's say, autocratic figures. They're not like a government or someone. It's not. It's a project that's being built with the explicit intent of like, look at me, I'm a beautiful building, and so they go to these stark architects, and it's kind of a closed loop if you think about it. If you're a closed architect, you're famous if you do a beautiful building. So they come to you for beautiful buildings, so you only do even more outrageous buildings, and it kind of keeps going on and on. And I think that Guggenheim was the first one that sort of started this thing. Um, I I think architects do have some power. I can think of a couple of architects who are big names who I think actually do sometimes do a good job of museums. I think of Chipperfield, the new museum in Berlin.
yeah.
I think Maron in Miami, the Perez Art Museum. All of these are projects that I think the brief was the same, create some sort of landmark, and I think the response was appropriate and very successful. And I think it does fall down to the architect, but it also depends largely on the context and who your client is at the end. And I agree with the point that Bhargav made about sort of seeding or giving some space for the public to sort of feel attached to the museum in some way. A lot of these elements are almost like little sculptures, sort of isolated in near the water or that kind of thing. But I think there can be attempts to sort of open up with larger gathering areas. I think honestly, I don't know if this is true or not, but it felt that, for example, Novel's museum with that big canopy did something that most museums don't do, which is allow people to roam around freely without having to look at art. It's not like the overall, but I think at least that felt like a gesture that was more generous than most museums would do. I think generosity and who you're working with are the two things that kind of decide what the response architects do. But I definitely think it's within their power, and I think it's how you respond to the brief, how convincing you can be to the client at certain.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned Jean Nouvel, because we wanted to ask also about, as a case study, one of his buildings. Amal, could you share presentation again?
Also another, because there's a lot of this work of other elements. Sorry, earlier this one went up. Let me just open this. Okay, on the video screen. Wait, let me check. Yep, I want to do this one. Okay. Present. This was what was supposed to show earlier, and no, Ezra.
Okay. Yeah, we wanted to discuss if cultural appropriation is applied in architecture. Like, what do you think about like the boundaries between adaptive use or so-called stealing a technique from another culture to use in a different purpose, like very traditional mural techniques or carved wood techniques in a part of the contemporary building, just to make it more interesting or appealing, or like adapting West African architectural elements being used in the European context. And also, to me, it's interesting that how Jean Nouvel become the representative of Arabic or Islamic architecture. And I don't like, as if there is such a thing, Islamic architecture. It's such a degrading the entire different folks and communities, but that's another discussion. But, like, as a French guy, he's kind of responsible, like he's that architect. He built World Arab Institute in 81 in Paris. Also, I think interior is very interesting. Then he built in Qatar and in Abu Dhabi. And he always studies, like, unlike Gary and Foster's, like, he doesn't have his own strong vocabulary. He studied local architecture and contemporize it and reuse it. That's worth to appreciate. But also, like, when we think of the scale of the project, actually they are very commercial, and they serve for political purposes more than the sake of architecture and culture. And also we have another example of Francis Kere. He's Amal, where he was from? Sorry.
Burkina Faso.
And he brings his architectural background, cultural background to. This is a photo of Coachella in 2019. Okay, this is kind of an art piece and installation. Also, he has another installation. This is Serpentine in UK in 2017. It must be. And can we say, like, when an architect from the country can bring, like, can study, and because there's nothing wrong with what Kere is doing, he's just bringing his background. But for us, like, we are also indecisive about that. Like, why a French guy, like, why a white guy is considered the face of so-called Islamic architecture? I'm really curious to hear from you guys.
I mean, I am actually very conflicted about this. I think I don't. I think they're not. I don't see them as reflective of Arab architecture, but I think, or I like John Novell is just a very successful star architect, and at some points an opportunist who sort of made most of what the opportunities he got to work with. But I think at some point, I do genuinely believe that these were not bad faith attempts by him to sort of like, I'm the architect who best designed buildings that represent Arabic culture or art. But I think that just ended up being him because of a lack of person who could do that, or the lack of effort of people look for that architect who can offer that kind of service or that kind of knowledge. Um, and I don't think it's effective. Like I think that building with the opening and closing sort of facade, I think that's very ridiculous. I don't think that's actually anything to do with Arabic architecture, but it's a successful building nonetheless. And I think this is the thing. There's also like the other side of it, to be honest, because architects like Francis Gehry are great. He has beautiful buildings, beautiful projects. He's very consistent with what he produces, but sometimes it almost feels like a trap as well. That unless you kind of stick to these or present that kind of architecture, your authenticity as an architect from Africa or an architect from India is also challenged. They're saying, "Oh, you can't be designing," because I don't think, and I think a lot of people make that point that modernity isn't just a Western project. It's actually a project that took place in a lot of countries at the same time all over the world. And I think even in Sudan, you can point at buildings and say these were modern style buildings that were designed by Sudanese architects conscious of the Sudanese context. And so I think instances of people trying to like use some kind of motif and say it reflects an entire culture are very, very shallow attempt at doing that. But at the same time, I think the conversation just a little bit has to expand to allow architects from these places to be modern and be more than just like some kind of mural or some kind of surface treatment or some kind of material treatment that reflect their entire country or their entire architectural practice.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's interesting because one of the other view from, I mean, as a common person would be like, uh, it's also the appreciation of the local architects.
Mm-hmm.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. We can hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I was like, it is so calm that I felt that.
We hear you.
So yeah, it also depends upon the appreciation of the local architects and this one, like bringing in like imagine like a generic perception of like even maybe this might be common with all the developing countries or the underdeveloped countries where people would perceive a guy with a foreign degree or foreign experience as has much more understanding of the local or local cultural aspects than the local guys. I mean, sometimes people, even the clients and the local generic people would prefer these kind of architecture, like especially like one of the like from Burkina Faso and the other example in a recent
Is it me or it's Bhargav?
No,
documentary.
No, sorry. You were saying also in a recent. You said the one from in a
in
recent.
in a recent documentary that I've seen, like
Mm-hmm.
especially in Africa, people have been using concrete mosques and all,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
rather than using the what do you say, local mud as a material for the construction, and how those spaces have become too hot, and they have started abandoning the whole perception of, oh, those Western concrete buildings should be much more stronger, like because the native people do have some conceptions about the work or kind of style from different architects or stuff from other countries. They believe that, oh, okay, they should I mean, they would know better than the way the current scenario. So that might be one of the reasons why people pick them as the face of the architecture. And but in reality, it's also I mean, for one of to be very much in specific, one of the reasons why Le Corbusier is considered one of the initial star architects who is great, because especially in India, he studied the climate of Indian climate, and he built accordingly that could meet the climatic conditions and the local architecture. So there are a few examples, but who actually the where the star architects took the additional role of understanding the local building climatology and typology in creating spaces. So I think it would go in both ways, like where we it's advantageous to showcase them as a face of the particular region, as well as sad part of the particular type of architecture.
It's very interesting. Me and Amal, we talk a lot about that cultural appropriation, and we never considered Corbusier's work in Chandigarh. Like somehow in our head is a modern master. Like we talk like very recent projects only.
AbuBakr, you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, one of the people, one of the examples I think of someone who's doing or trying to kind of recapture that sort of local that local kind of identity. I don't know if you know Mariam Kamara, who's an architect who's in Niger, and she built a series of mosques projects, and I can write her name in the chat, but but it was basically very much in the local sort of building materials, local context, with a modern sort of element to it. And I felt that that was one of the best example of a kind of a marriage between using your local context, using the materials there, and at the same time capturing a level of modernity and at the, sort of to reflect it. And it was a mosque, honestly, that she designed. And I think there can be room for both. I just think like people need there needs to be a sort of resistance to this idea that one architect with one facade can represent an entire architectural movement or an architectural sort of heritage.
But it's also about how that at the end, all the buildings we are talking about, they are buildings of certain cultural institutions. They have like very significant role all around the world, and they declare mission in a very assertive manner. Like they say, we represent the culture of Arabic hub. I don't know what does it mean. So that's why like we believe being critical and like pushing that questions are important.
Especially that some of these museums are what are considered national museums that are very much related so much of the time with the local identity and local architectural identity. And so it also becomes interesting that when we talk about, for example, something like architectural appropriation, when it comes to cultural appropriation, when it comes to architecture, it's much more complicated because in the end, you know, architecture has a very practical and functional role. And so some of these techniques and things are done because they've worked for so much of the time. So if you have the Mashrabiyya, for example, in all the architecture in North Africa, especially in Cairo, it was done because of the way the weather was, the way the society was developed at that time, how they wanted privacy, all of these different things. And so it becomes interesting when some of these elements are taken out of context and, like AbuBakr was saying earlier, reduced just to, for example, murals or facades, and not implemented in a way that really studies the connection between those buildings and how they can be built today. So it would be very interesting to have like more proper studies, research, or conversations about how architecture can be reflected in this day and age that really creates a perfect marriage between all of these different elements.
But although the way John Nouvel study Mashrubiya is exactly in the same purpose of context, but it's still very problematic building. So my problem was why I have to appreciate a French guy, modern, contemporarized and local architectural element. And he received so many critics from local associations, and they are not represented enough in the media, and still some architectural school of thoughts we trust, they sort of approve the project.
I think it's
it seems he used for the climate purpose and the lightning purpose, but he completely changed the scale. So indeed, it's out of context.
Exactly. And I think also the lack of inclusion of locals other than the government.
Yeah, local parties.
Exactly, local parties is sometimes problematic. Anyone?
Wow. It was such a genuine conversation, guys. I can keep talking like 2 more hours.
Something at the end before we start wrapping up, we start closing. Is there any comment here or there? Bhargav?
I wanted to ask a question, or you can go ahead, Bhargav.
I was thinking, especially in the final comments, final discussion, what we were having, it was interesting because for these buildings, like the cultural buildings that we see, for most of the people, or the commentary that's been generated by the people is all about a particular element of the whole design. Like even if you look, a particular element has become the complete style of architecture, rather than the utilization of spaces and the experience of, rather than or even the experience of the space, the whole use of a particular element, like even patterns and all. So I was interested that because if you go once, if we experience any of these buildings, or if a common man experience those spaces, they would just say, oh, that particular pattern, all they would remember is that particular pattern is a Arabic element or Islamic art. So, and they will uh, represent the whole building as Islamic building. Even over here, if you look at few of the mosques in United States, they actually don't reflect the complete how a mosque would be in other parts of the world. For a regular, what do you say, there's no need to be in a particular way, but over here people just there are few mosques where with the regular brick facade, or they
Sorry, you could just sit again.
We missed after brick facade.
Oh, okay. So for a brick facade, what they do is they just add a particular Islamic art or Islamic window or something, and they would say, "Oh, that's a
Islamic window.
I mean that's what like that I'm saying on in terms of like an American mind or American person saying that, oh, that's an Islamic window, so that should be a mosque or something, like which would represent a particular culture, a particular that's how most of the Americans or most of the people over here use those spaces, like saying that's how build. I mean, not that's how they try to. Uh, what do you say? Inflict their own understanding of a particular culture into a single element.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that happens a lot throughout the Western countries. Maybe that's one of the areas where a much more education, or even not just education, more awareness of the culture would enhance their perception of these spaces.
I wanted to ask like one last thing, because you guys brought the idea of using a certain element to describe a building, like, and Amal mentioned the Mashrubiya. I always I think about how can these backgrounds or cultural heritage or architectural heritage grow. But that's one thing kind of don't think about that much, of like what of traditional Islamic architecture, if you were to call it that, just for the, like, what does it become as time moves on? And I think if we are, there's this worry if that we are always insisted that it's respected or it's preserved or it's like kind of copied the same with no updates and no sort of space to what does it become. And then, and I mean, I think all these bad attempts are just because no one really kind of, like, there's no space to discuss what growth looks like for these. And I think that's one thing we kind of like need to think about, of how does it change, how does it adapt to different climates. I mean, the whole idea that climate change is happening and their needs are going to be different, especially for hotter areas. All of these things are going to affect very much the architecture that takes place or is built there. And there needs to be some form of growth or change that's acceptable, that's sustainable for these cultures. And maybe all these bad attempts are just attempts at growth in some way or another, if that's one way to think about it, you know.
Yeah.
So,
But for me, it's like a lot to do with political understanding and stance, like looking at the nation states. Like also, we were talking a lot with Amal when I was defending my thesis. I had to use the terms, like even now we all have understanding of problematic description of Arabic architecture, but we keep talking about it.
Yeah.
It's like using adapting the colonizers' colonial language,
Yeah.
and we just, I don't know, don't have energy to creating new terms. But at the end, you have to communicate with people, and that terminology is very limited. That's my only comment.
okay, I think this was a very fruitful discussion. It was really nice. And sometimes I felt like I would like to go with one discussion on one thread, but I knew that I would be spending 2 hours on one topic. And so it would be really, really great to have this conversation in the future. You were saying?
Yeah.
No, yeah, saying we saved a lot for future discussions. We can